1 week after her father's funeral, 72-year-old Margaret Whitmore sat quietly at the end of a long mahogany table while her relatives fought like strangers over everything he had left behind. The lakeside mansion, the farmland, the investment accounts, the antique collection. Voices grew louder, tempers exploded, and greed filled the room. Margaret said nothing. For 15 years, she had been the one caring for her aging father while everyone else visited only on holidays. Yet when the lawyer finally finished reading the will, the family burst into laughter. The mansion went to Richard. The land went to Linda. The business assets were divided among the grandchildren. And Margaret? She was given a rusty old RV abandoned behind a collapsing barn. Her cousins mocked her. Her nephews took pictures and posted them online. Even the lawyer looked uncomfortable as he handed her the keys. But 3 months later, those same relatives would stand frozen in disbelief outside that forgotten RV, realizing they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because hidden inside the vehicle they had laughed at was a secret that had been buried for more than 60 years. A secret worth far more than the mansion, the land, and every dollar they had fought so desperately to claim. And by the time they discovered the truth, it was already too late. The morning after the funeral, the Whitmore estate felt less like a family home and more like a battlefield waiting for the first shot. Luxury cars lined the driveway, and relatives who had barely spoken to Arthur Whitmore in years suddenly filled every room of the mansion. Margaret arrived early, carrying a small box of her father's personal belongings, a worn pocket watch, a pair of reading glasses, and a faded photograph from decades ago. While she carefully placed the items on a table in the library, she could hear voices echoing through the halls. Nobody was talking about Arthur. Nobody was sharing memories or stories about the man who had built the family's fortune from nothing. Instead, every conversation revolved around one thing: money. Richard Whitmore stood near the fireplace like a king surveying his kingdom. He spoke confidently about what should happen to the lakeside mansion, insisting that as the oldest surviving member of the family, he deserved ownership of the property. Across the room, Linda argued that the commercial land near the highway was far more valuable and should belong to her because she had always supported the family. Their voices grew louder with every passing minute. Meanwhile, Jason Whitmore sat at the dining table with a laptop open, calculating property values and investment portfolios as if the inheritance had already been divided. Margaret watched silently from a corner chair. The behavior disgusted her, but it didn't surprise her. For years, she had seen the distance grow between her father and the rest of the family. When Arthur's health began failing 15 years earlier, everyone promised to help. At first, they visited occasionally. Then the visits became monthly, then yearly. Eventually, most of them stopped coming altogether. Birthdays were forgotten. Holidays were skipped. Phone calls went unanswered. Through it all, Margaret remained by her father's side. She remembered countless sleepless nights sitting beside his hospital bed. She remembered helping him walk when his legs became too weak. She remembered reading books aloud when his eyesight faded, and preparing meals when he could no longer cook for himself. There were years when her entire life revolved around caring for him. Yet, she never complained. To Margaret, family wasn't measured by what someone left behind. Family was measured by who stayed when things became difficult. At exactly 10 o'clock, attorney Samuel Bennett entered the room carrying a thick leather briefcase. Conversations immediately stopped. Every head turned toward him. The tension became almost unbearable. Samuel had served as Arthur Whitmore's lawyer for more than 3 decades, and everyone knew he was about to reveal the contents of the will. The family gathered around the massive dining table. Richard sat at the head. Linda positioned herself beside him. Jason opened a notebook and prepared to take notes. Margaret chose a seat near the far end of the room, away from the arguments and expectations. Samuel adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Arthur Whitmore prepared this final will and testament approximately 4 years before his passing. He began. He reviewed and reaffirmed its contents multiple times. Richard smiled confidently. Linda exchanged excited glances with Jason. Samuel continued reading. The investment accounts were divided among several family members. Certain pieces of land were assigned to various relatives. Antique collections were distributed according to Arthur's instructions. Every announcement triggered reactions around the room. Some smiled, others frowned. Several immediately began discussing the value of what they had received. Then came the lakeside mansion. Richard straightened in his chair. The Whitmore family residence, Samuel announced, is awarded to Richard Whitmore. A satisfied grin spread across Richard's face. Well, he said proudly, that only makes sense. Margaret lowered her eyes, not because she wanted the mansion, but because she could almost hear her father's disappointment. The reading continued for another 20 minutes, until only one item remained undistributed. Samuel paused. His expression changed. The room grew quiet. There is one final asset, specifically addressed by Arthur Whitmore. For the first time, Margaret looked up. Samuel opened a separate envelope sealed with Arthur's signature. To my daughter Margaret. The room instantly fell silent. Richard frowned. Linda leaned forward. Samuel unfolded the letter and read aloud. Margaret, if you are hearing this, then I am gone. Thank you for every sacrifice you made for me. Thank you for staying when others left. Thank you for being the only person who never asked for anything in return. Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes. Across the table, several relatives looked uncomfortable. Samuel continued. As for my final gift, I leave to Margaret my recreational vehicle currently located behind the old barn. The room remained silent for 1 second. Then someone laughed. Another joined. Within moments, the entire table erupted with laughter. The RV? Linda said between chuckles. That rusty piece of junk? Jason added. Richard shook his head and smirked. Arthur must have been feeling sentimental. Margaret said nothing. She simply accepted the small brass key Samuel placed in her hand. The laughter continued as family members congratulated each other on their inheritances. Nobody noticed the final sentence Samuel had quietly skipped because it was written separately beneath Arthur's signature. A sentence that would soon change everything. And outside, hidden behind decades of dust, rust, and forgotten memories, an old RV waited patiently for someone worthy enough to discover the truth concealed within its walls. 3 days after the will was read, Margaret drove to the far edge of the Whitmore property for the first time in years. The old barn stood exactly where she remembered it, leaning slightly to one side as if age itself had become too heavy to carry. Tall weeds surrounded the area, and thick vines climbed the weathered wooden walls. Behind the barn, partially hidden beneath overgrown branches and years of neglect, sat the RV. For a moment, Margaret simply stared at it. Her relatives had not exaggerated. The vehicle looked terrible. Rust covered large sections of the metal body. Several windows were clouded with dirt. One tire had completely deflated, and patches of peeling paint exposed decades of wear beneath. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a forgotten relic from another era. Margaret walked closer. Despite its condition, something felt strangely familiar. She remembered seeing the RV when she was a little girl. Her father used to take family trips in it during the summers. Back then, it had represented adventure and freedom. She could still remember laughing beside campfires and waking up to the sound of birds in places far from home. Running her fingers along the faded exterior, she smiled sadly. The others saw junk. She saw memories. Using the brass key Samuel had given her, Margaret unlocked the door. The hinges groaned loudly as it swung open. A wave of stale air rushed out. Dust covered nearly every surface. Old curtains hung beside the windows. A small dining table remained bolted to the floor. Cabinets lined one wall. Everything appeared frozen in time. Margaret stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath her feet. For the next several hours, she cleaned. She opened windows. She swept away dust. She wiped down counters. She removed boxes filled with broken tools and old camping supplies. Piece by piece, the RV began revealing traces of its past. Late that afternoon, as sunlight streamed through one of the side windows, Margaret discovered something unusual. Inside a cabinet above the driver's seat sat a small stack of leather-bound journals. She carefully removed them. The The cover of the first journal bore her father's initials, A.W. Her heart skipped. She sat down and opened the first page. Inside were handwritten notes describing family road trips from decades earlier. Some pages contained sketches of mountains, lakes, and campgrounds. Others held photographs carefully taped into place. Margaret smiled as she turned the pages. Then she noticed something strange. Several entries seemed incomplete. Certain pages ended abruptly. Names had been crossed out. Dates were missing. Almost as if someone had intentionally removed parts of the story. The discovery puzzled her. Her father had always been meticulous. He never left unfinished records. As evening approached, Margaret continued searching through the RV. Behind one bench seat, she found a small wooden box containing dozens of old photographs. Most showed family vacations. Some featured Arthur as a young man. Others showed people Margaret didn't recognize. One photograph caught her attention immediately. It showed Arthur standing beside an older man in front of a mining operation somewhere in the mountains. On the back, someone had written, "Never tell them until the right person finds the road." Margaret frowned. The message made no sense. She set the photo aside and continued sorting through the box. The next morning, she returned, and the day after that, what began as simple cleaning slowly became an obsession. The RV seemed full of small mysteries. Notes hidden inside books, maps folded between seat cushions, letters tucked into cabinets. Yet none of them provided enough information to explain what her father had been trying to preserve. 1 week later, Margaret invited Emily Carter to help organize the remaining contents. The teenager arrived carrying cleaning supplies and enough enthusiasm to brighten the gloomy vehicle. Honestly, Emily laughed while dusting a shelf. "Your family must be crazy. I'd rather have this old RV than some giant mansion." Margaret smiled. "You might be the only person who thinks that." "Maybe," Emily replied, "but old things usually hide the best stories." Those words lingered in Margaret's mind. That afternoon, while moving a heavy storage compartment beneath one of the beds, Emily accidentally knocked against a wooden wall panel. A hollow sound echoed through the RV. Both froze. Emily knocked again. The sound repeated. Hollow, not solid. Margaret slowly knelt beside the panel. Something wasn't right. Most of the RV walls felt thick and sturdy. This section sounded completely different. Together, they examined the area more closely. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. But after brushing away years of dirt, Margaret noticed a faint outline running along the edges. A hidden compartment. Her pulse quickened. She searched the surrounding area until she found a tiny metal latch concealed beneath a decorative trim piece. Carefully, she pulled it. Nothing happened. The compartment remained sealed. There was a lock somewhere, but no visible keyhole. Margaret sat back, staring at the hidden panel. For the first time since inheriting the RV, she felt certain of one thing. Her father had hidden something inside this vehicle. Something important. Something he never wanted the rest of the family to find. That evening, after Emily left, Margaret continued searching alone. Hours passed. Night settled outside. The interior lights cast long shadows across the aging walls. Then, while flipping through her father's old Bible, she noticed several pages near the center had been cut slightly shorter than the rest. Curious, she opened the section. A small brass key slipped out and landed in her lap. Margaret stared at it in shock. The key was old, very old. Attached to it was a tiny piece of paper written in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. Only 6 words appeared on the note. The truth was never the mansion. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Inside the RV, she closed her hand around the key, and for the first time, she realized that the inheritance battle had never truly been about property. It had been about a secret hidden for more than 60 years. And she was now holding the first piece of the puzzle. Margaret barely slept that night. The old brass key remained on the table beside her bed, and every time she closed her eyes, she heard her father's words echoing in her mind. The truth was never the mansion. By sunrise, she was already driving back to the RV. The morning air was cool, and a light fog drifted across the fields surrounding the old barn. As she climbed the steps into the vehicle, her heart pounded harder than it had in years. The hidden compartment waited silently. Margaret removed the key from her pocket. For a moment, she simply stared at the wooden panel. Her father had spent decades protecting whatever was hidden inside. Now she was about to discover why. After examining every inch of the compartment, she finally noticed a tiny brass opening hidden behind a removable decorative piece. The key fit perfectly. She turned it slowly. A soft click echoed through the RV. Then another. The entire wooden panel shifted forward. Margaret carefully pulled it open and froze. The hidden space was much larger than she expected. It stretched deep into the wall of the RV. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals stacked neatly on wooden shelves, several metal document boxes, bundles of letters tied together with faded ribbon, rolled maps, photographs, and a small steel safe. For several seconds, Margaret simply stared. Her father hadn't hidden a few family keepsakes. He had hidden an entire archive, an entire history. Her hands trembled as she reached for the first journal. The cover was worn with age. Stamped into the leather were initials she didn't recognize. E.W. Opening the first page, she discovered a date, the 12th of March, 1963. The journal belonged to her grandfather, Edward Whitmore. Margaret immediately sat down and began reading. The entries described a period of the family's history she had never heard about. At the time, Edward Whitmore was traveling throughout several western states with a group of business partners. According to the journal, they were searching for investment opportunities involving mining operations and undeveloped land. Most of the early entries seemed ordinary. Then everything changed. Several weeks later, Edward described discovering a remote property containing unusually valuable mineral deposits. The location was mentioned repeatedly. Yet every time the exact coordinates appeared, they had been written in a strange coded format. Almost as if someone expected the journals to be found by the wrong person, Margaret continued reading. Page after page revealed a story more astonishing than anything she had imagined. In 1964, Edward Whitmore and several partners quietly purchased ownership stakes in a little-known mining operation. At the time, experts believed the land held minimal value. Most investors ignored it. But Edward's research suggested otherwise. He became convinced the property contained enormous deposits of minerals that future technologies would desperately need. The journals described his excitement, his optimism, his certainty that the investment would someday transform the family's future. Then the entries suddenly grew darker. One journal described betrayal among business partners. Another referenced legal disputes. Several pages mentioned individuals attempting to obtain ownership records, and then Margaret found a sentence that made her blood run cold. If anything happens to me, Arthur must protect the documents. The family cannot be trusted with this knowledge. Margaret lowered the journal. She read the sentence again. And again. The family cannot be trusted. Those words had been written more than 60 years earlier. Yet they perfectly described what she had witnessed during the inheritance meeting. Her grandfather had seen it coming decades before it happened. As the hours passed, Margaret worked through more journals. The story slowly unfolded. Edward Whitmore had eventually transferred critical ownership documents to his son Arthur. Shortly afterward, a series of financial crises and legal complications caused the mining operation to disappear from public attention. Many assumed the investment had failed. Over time, it was forgotten entirely. But according to the journals, the ownership rights never disappeared. They simply remained dormant, waiting, hidden, preserved. Margaret's attention eventually shifted to one of the metal document boxes. Inside were dozens of official papers, property deeds, corporate ownership certificates, legal agreements. Most were decades old, yet many still appeared valid. Then she found something extraordinary. A folder labeled For Margaret. Her breath caught. She carefully opened it. Inside rested a handwritten letter from her father. The paper had yellowed with age. Arthur's familiar handwriting filled every page. Tears formed in Margaret's eyes as she began reading. "My dear Margaret, if you have found this letter, then you have already proven something important. You were willing to look beyond appearances. Everyone else will choose the mansion. They will choose the land. They will choose whatever seems valuable at first glance. But true wealth has never belonged to the impatient." Margaret wiped away a tear. The words felt as though her father were sitting beside her. The letter continued. Arthur explained that he had spent years studying Edward's records. He had personally verified the ownership claims. He had tracked the dormant assets. And he had discovered something remarkable. The forgotten mining rights were no longer connected to ordinary minerals. The land sat above one of the largest undeveloped lithium and rare earth deposits in the region. Resources now worth millions, possibly tens of millions, perhaps even more. Margaret's hands began shaking. She struggled to process what she was reading. The mansion her relatives had fought over was valuable, but compared to what her father described, it was insignificant. Then she reached the final page, and the final revelation. The ownership documents are not stored in a bank. They are not held by any lawyer. They remain exactly where your grandfather placed them. Follow the maps. Find Ethan Brooks. Trust no one else. Margaret stared at the signature, Arthur Whitmore. The room felt silent. Outside, wind rustled through the trees. Inside the RV, 60 years of secrets suddenly connected into a single truth. The rusty vehicle was never the inheritance. It was the key. The key to a fortune hidden in plain sight for generations. But as Margaret carefully returned the letter to its folder, she failed to notice something happening far beyond the old barn. Across town, Jason Whitmore was sitting in his office reviewing public property records. And for the first time, he had discovered evidence suggesting that Arthur Whitmore may have hidden something far more valuable than anyone had realized. The inheritance battle was no longer over. In fact, it was only beginning. The following morning, Margaret locked every document back inside the hidden compartment before leaving the RV. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something she hadn't felt in years' purpose. The mystery was no longer about old family history. It was about finishing a journey her grandfather had started more than 60 years earlier, and her father had protected until his final breath. Before leaving, she carefully copied several names, dates, and locations from the journals into a notebook. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Ethan Brooks, the same name her father had mentioned in his final letter. By noon, Margaret was driving through the countryside toward a small town nearly 2 hours away. The directions had been hidden inside one of Edward Whitmore's journals. According to the notes, Ethan lived near an abandoned railway line on the edge of town. The house was modest and weathered by time. A pickup truck sat in the driveway. Wind chimes rattled softly on the porch. Margaret took a deep breath and knocked. Several seconds passed, then the door opened. Standing before her was an elderly man with white hair, a short gray beard, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to recognize her immediately. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the old man smiled. "Margaret Whitmore," he said quietly. Margaret froze. "You know who I am?" Ethan nodded. "I've been expecting you for 20 years. The words sent a chill down her spine. Inside the house, Ethan listened carefully as Margaret explained everything she had discovered. She showed him copies of the journals, photographs, and her father's letter. When she finished, Ethan sat silently for a long moment. Then he stood and walked toward a bookshelf. From behind several old books, he removed a small wooden box. The box looked ancient. The corners were worn smooth by age. Its brass latch had turned dark with time. Ethan placed it on the table. "Your grandfather gave this to me in 1968, he said. Margaret stared at him. "He told me never to open it unless someone carrying the Whitmore family journals came looking for answers." Slowly, Ethan opened the lid. Inside lay several yellowed envelopes and a folded map. Margaret immediately recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Edward Whitmore. Ethan carefully unfolded the map. It showed a remote section of land located several hundred miles away in the mountains. Red markings covered certain areas. Numbers and symbols appeared in the margins. At first glance, it seemed impossible to understand. Then Ethan pointed toward one specific location. That's where everything started. Margaret leaned closer. What exactly did my grandfather discover? Ethan exhaled slowly. The future. Margaret frowned. Ethan smiled. Not literally. But he discovered something that wouldn't become valuable until decades later. He explained that during the early 1960s, Edward Whitmore had become fascinated by emerging technologies. While most investors focused on oil, agriculture, or manufacturing, Edward became obsessed with rare minerals used in advanced batteries and electronics. At the time, very few people cared. The deposits seemed nearly worthless, but Edward believed the world would eventually depend on them. Most people laughed at him. Some called him reckless, others called him crazy, yet he invested anyway. And according to Ethan, he was right. Very right. Over the next hour, Ethan revealed information hidden from the family for generations. The mining rights connected to the Whitmore holdings had never been sold, never transferred, never surrendered. They remained legally attached to a series of dormant ownership agreements. For decades, the assets sat unnoticed because nobody realized their true significance. Then, technology changed. Electric vehicles exploded in popularity. Battery manufacturing expanded worldwide. Demand for lithium and rare earth minerals skyrocketed, and suddenly, the forgotten land Edward purchased decades earlier became extraordinarily valuable. Margaret struggled to process everything. How valuable? She finally asked. Ethan looked at her seriously. Potentially tens of millions. The room fell silent. Margaret looked down at the map. Tens of millions, all hidden behind an old RV everyone had laughed at. But the surprises weren't finished. Ethan handed her another envelope. Inside was a more recent letter, written by Arthur. The date shocked her. It had been written only 6 months before his death. Ethan, the letter began, if Margaret arrives, it means she found the truth. Help her complete what my father started, but be careful. Once the others realize what was hidden, they will come. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Her father had anticipated everything, even this moment. Ethan nodded slowly. Arthur knew his family better than anyone. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Jason Whitmore sat inside his law office, staring at a property database. What began as casual curiosity had become something much more dangerous. After reviewing dozens of old records connected to Edward Whitmore, Jason had discovered references to dormant mineral rights. At first, he assumed it was a clerical error. Then he found another reference, and another, and another. Now he sat surrounded by printed documents. The numbers made no sense. The potential value was enormous, far larger than the inheritance everyone had fought over. Jason immediately called Richard. When Richard answered, Jason wasted no time. There's something you need to see. An hour later, Richard and Linda sat across from him. Jason spread the documents across the conference table. At first, neither relative understood what they were looking at. Then, Jason explained. Silence filled the room. Richard's face slowly lost its color. Linda stared in disbelief. You're telling me, she whispered. Jason nodded. The RV wasn't the junk inheritance. Richard slammed his hand against the table. No. His voice was barely audible. No, that's impossible. But deep down, all three of them already knew the truth. They had spent weeks celebrating their victory. They had mocked Margaret, laughed at her, pitied her, and now they were beginning to understand the scale of their mistake. For the first time since Arthur Whitmore's funeral, panic entered the room, because if Margaret truly possessed the documents hidden inside that RV, then the real Whitmore fortune belonged to her, and they had no idea how to get it back. As the evening sun cast long shadows across Ethan's living room, Margaret carefully gathered the journals, maps, and letters that had survived more than 60 years of secrecy. What had begun as a humiliating inheritance, a rusty RV abandoned behind an old barn, had become something far greater than she ever imagined. Piece by piece, the truth was finally emerging. Her grandfather had hidden a fortune. Her father had protected it. And now, the responsibility had passed to her. For the first time since Arthur's death, Margaret felt close to him again. Every journal entry, every handwritten note, and every carefully preserved document carried his voice, guiding her toward a truth he had spent decades safeguarding from the wrong hands. The mansion, the land, and the money her relatives fought over were never the heart of the Whitmore legacy. They were only distractions. But while Margaret was uncovering her family's greatest secret, a storm was quietly gathering elsewhere. Richard, Linda, and Jason had finally realized the mistake they had made. The inheritance they mocked could be worth more than everything they had claimed combined. Their laughter had turned into desperation, and desperation had begun turning into greed. Holding the final letter from her father, Margaret looked out the window toward the fading horizon. She knew the journey was far from over. Somewhere beyond the mountains lay the final proof of the hidden fortune, and somewhere behind her, relatives blinded by greed were preparing to chase it. The real battle for the Whitmore legacy was only beginning, and this time, the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story of resilience, justice, and hidden truths. Margaret's journey reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and that the things people overlook often hold the greatest value. While her relatives fought over what seemed important, they missed the one inheritance that truly mattered, a legacy built on trust, patience, and the courage to seek the truth. Stories like this are not just about money or fortune. They are about character. They remind us that kindness, loyalty, and perseverance often lead to rewards that greed can never claim. Margaret never demanded anything, never fought for more than her share, and never allowed bitterness to define her. Yet in the end, she discovered what everyone else had overlooked because she was willing to look beyond the surface. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have opened the RV right away, or would you have ignored it like everyone else? Share your answer in the comments below. Your thoughts and discussions help bring these stories to life and inspire future ones. Thank you for watching and being part of this community. Until our next story, remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are not hidden in grand mansions, luxury estates, or bank vaults. They are hidden in forgotten places, waiting for the right person to uncover them. Stay safe, stay hopeful, and we'll see you in the next story.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to subscribe my channel.